Hello everyone. I spent 30 days improving my English with one simple sentence structure. Listen carefully and repeat after me. Let's practice some common English phrases that people use every day. Let's get started. Welcome back to my channel. I am Wadka, me. How about going for a walk?
How about going for a walk?
How about watching a movie tonight?
How about watching a movie tonight?
How about trying this new restaurant?
How about trying this new restaurant?
How about taking a break?
How about taking a break?
How about going to the beach?
How about going to the beach?
How about meeting for coffee?
How about meeting for coffee?
How about studying together?
How about studying together?
How about cooking dinner at home?
How about cooking dinner at home?
How about listening to some music?
How about listening to some music?
How about calling your parents?
How about calling your parents?
How about joining us for lunch?
How about joining us for lunch?
How about reading this book?
How about reading this book?
How about helping me with this?
How about helping me with this?
How about painting the room?
How about painting the room?
How about cleaning the garage?
How about cleaning the garage?
How about taking a day off?
How about visiting the museum?
How about learning a new language?
How about taking a day off?
How about playing a board game?
How about learning a new language?
How about visiting the museum?
How about playing a board game?
How about going shopping?
How about going shopping?
How about exercising together?
How about exercising together?
How about writing a letter?
How about writing a letter?
How about organizing your desk?
How about organizing your desk?
How about going hiking this weekend?
How about going hiking this weekend?
How about practicing your English?
How about practicing your English?
How about making a cake?
How about making a cake?
How about watching the sunset?
How about watching the sunset?
How about spending the day outside?
How about spending the day outside?
How about going for a bike ride?
How about going for a bike ride?
How about working on the project?
How about working on the project?
How about volunteering this weekend?
How about volunteering this weekend?
How about exploring the city?
How about exploring the city?
How about doing yoga in the morning?
How about doing yoga in the morning?
How about taking some photos?
How about taking some photos?
How about making a to-do list?
How about making a to-do list?
How about joining a gym?
How about joining a gym?
How about attending the event?
How about attending the event?
How about starting a journal?
How about starting a journal?
How about gardening this afternoon?
How about gardening this afternoon?
How about going camping?
How about going camping?
How about checking out that book?
How about checking out that book?
How about practicing the piano?
How about practicing the piano?
How about writing a story?
How about writing a story?
How about doing some drawing?
How about doing some drawing?
How about making a scrapbook?
How about making a scrapbook?
How about planning a trip?
How about planning a trip?
How about decorating your room?
How about decorating your room?
How about meditating for a while?
How about meditating for a while?
How about watching a documentary?
How about watching a documentary?
How about learning to cook?
How about learning to cook?